Hello and welcome to History by Hollywood, a podcast series that examines the real events and people behind fact-based movies. And either Andrew or I have said that phrase 73 times now. Wow. This is episode 73, which is how I knew that, for Sunday the 17th of May 2020, and this week we're covering the much underrated and neglected 1979 epic Zulu Dawn, telling the story of the Battle of Isandhlwana between British troops and the warriors of King Cetshwayo's Zulu nation, a battle that immediately preceded the action at Rorke's Drift, the tale of which was told in the 1964 classic movie Zulu, which we covered in episode 8. My name is Martin Darlington, and this week I will be joined for the main show by our returning guest host and great friend of the show, Des Latham, as we examine the dramatic events of this opening battle of a war that would last for months and cost the British Empire its worst ever defeat at the hands of warriors, largely armed with traditional weapons rather than firearms. Now, Des is the host of the Anglo-Boer War Podcast, and we will of course include a link in the show notes to his show, which is very highly recommended. He has a very engaging and relaxed delivery which makes listening a real pleasure, and his research and information is detailed, clear and fascinating, and he provides a really effective context for the information he gives. In updates and errata, just one tidbit we failed to mention in our last episode, The People versus Larry Flynt, which I do apologise, folks, it does seem an awful long time ago, so I'm sorry for our hiatus. The detail was that after a conviction in Ohio for discharging a firearm, a conviction that Larry Flynt still disputes to this day, he served his 30-day sentence and was then released. Prosecutor Simon Lease, who was seen in the movie, the bald-headed prosecutor who was so passionate in his attempts to get Larry Flynt sent down, and in Larry Flynt's words, Simon Lease never let the law stand in the way of his zeal. He charged Larry with perjury on the grounds that he pleaded not guilty to the firearms offence, yet was found guilty, so he must have lied and therefore perjured himself. A judge quietly quashed that one. In news and reviews, we don't have any new reviews to read. Just a minute there. That was on Wednesday that I recorded the original intro, and on Thursday we received 2 reviews, and now it's Friday. So, one of them, short and sweet and to the point. This is from Podman166 from the United States. It's 5 stars and it's entitled Hammer Hard and Butter Smooth. And he says, I followed Martin here from Motopod. Very entertaining. And that's it. Love it. The explanation there, Hammer Hard, Butter Smooth, is Motopod obviously was a bike racing podcast that I used to co-host. And I was a particular proponent of one, Jorge Lorenzo, triple world champion at the top level. And Jorge had a thing of he had to be as smooth as butter, but also as hard as a hammer. And there were different times in different races he'd apply one or other, or both of those approaches to racing bikes. So thank you so much, Podman166. We then got one from RIT Film Prof. Now I'm guessing this is Mark Dupre, our friend from Rochester, and not Rochester, I think in New York, or certainly New England. Or was it Massachusetts? Oh goodness, I'm going to be in trouble again with Mark. So sorry, but it's a fascinating place and so entwined in American history it needs a podcast series of its own if anyone's volunteering. So Mark gives us 5 stars and a must listen. He says, this is a must for anyone interested in film or history, and especially for those interested in the intersection of film and history. If you've ever wondered how much of a so-called true story is actually true, this is what you've been waiting for. Andrew and Martin are film buffs and genuine historians and don't claim to be anything else. They do their research yet never take a condescending view of any film they cover. They understand that films often need to condense or streamline, and they don't get picky over points that don't really matter. As a film professor, I listen to just a few well-chosen film podcasts, and this is one of them. As an American, I love the accents and also love the fact that they don't jump on the let's trash America bandwagon. They obviously spur each other onto excellence, and they have a subtle sense of humour that makes their observations engaging. I look forward to each new podcast, and I can't recommend this podcast enough to lovers of film and history alike. Wow, I'm blushing. Mark, and I hope it is Mark, if it's someone other than Mark, there's another Rochester Institute of Technology film professor who's written a podcast review for us. Please do let us know your name, but I assume that's Mark Dupre, and humbled. That's so kind of you to say that. Very nice words. And I'm slightly blushing because obviously we're reading out things that say we're really good ourselves whilst reading them out, which is mildly sort of self-promoting, but hey, if we don't do it, no one else is going to. Well, actually they are. Mark's done it, but I just wanted to bring his review to a wider audience. If anyone does feel like writing a review who hasn't done so yet, it would be fantastic if you did, and of course we'll give you a shout out, unless you'd rather we didn't. So with that, we'll get back to the Wednesday's intro, so jump back into the HBH time machine and over to me. We heard from our great friend and fellow podcaster and regular guest host now, Sean Munger, whose green screen show is continuing to put some great episodes up, the latest being The Empire Strikes Back. Yep, the guys are looking at the realistic aspects of living on an ice moon in the second outing of the original Star Wars trilogy, seen by many to be one of the strongest movies in the Star Wars library. Gary Shavit wrote in, and typical Gary, it was within a couple of hours of Larry Flint hitting the airwaves, and he said, wow, 2 great podcasts. He was referring to Larry Flint and Denial, which preceded it. Very thought-provoking comments about free speech and freedom overall. The government is supposed to protect citizens from the outside and internal threats, but who protects me from the government that gets elected by people who think differently from me? It's going to keep me up thinking about how to walk the tightrope without falling. At least with Coal Miner's Daughter, I'll get a break and just enjoy great acting, even though I hate country music. Brilliant. Typical Gary Shavit email, that. Short, pithy, to the point. Lovely. We also heard from Brad Michael. Now, Brad is the recently retired FBI agent to whom we've referred several times. He's been very supportive recently. And Brad told us something we had no idea about, although proper movie buffs are probably all over this. For those like us, did you know that Woody Harrelson's father, Woody Harrelson of course playing Larry Flint in our last outing, his father Charles Harrison was a convicted contract killer. He was implicated in a number of hits over the years, but the one that saw him put away was of a judge, a guy called John Wood, who was about to oversee the trial of a Texas drug lord, who figured he'd get a better chance with a judge whose nickname wasn't Maximum John. Harrelson Sr. was caught, convicted and sent to a maximum security prison where he died some years ago. Who'd have thunk it? Friend of the show, Doug Moore, also pitched in on the freedom of speech conundrum and pointed out that we sounded as if Denial and Larry Flint were presenting 2 sides of an argument, whereas Doug suggests the opposite and that they're both in support of freedom of expression, Denial taking the point that this doesn't, though, mean you can state something as fact without being challenged. I totally agree, and I thought I'd made that very point, but listening back, realised I didn't get to that bit, me and my rabbit holes, eh? So thank you, Doug, and for anyone who was wondering the same, our conclusion was meant to support the conclusions of both Denial and Larry Flint and say, yeah, it's incredibly important. We also heard from a listener who simply referred to himself as Seth, and he asked a very brief question, which is one of the most thought-provoking we've ever had. He said, which has been the most inaccurate movie you've reviewed? Wow. Well, there's 2 possible criteria here. The specific accuracy of detail and facts, or the accuracy of meaning. Now, Pocahontas failed on both counts, but then maybe we have to take account of the fact that it's a Disney cartoon aimed at a younger audience, and I'm not even referring to the talking raccoon and the like. The same mitigation might be pleaded by Sound of Music. Now, Gladiator has to be fairly dubious in the accuracy stakes, with a fictitious main character, a fictitious death of the main villain, albeit a real person, and an ambition that never existed, namely to return Rome to the people in the Senate, which, as we pointed out on several occasions, is not the same thing. Braveheart, strangely, isn't even close to being the most inaccurate. 300, on the other hand, probably is. Good Morning Vietnam's another contender, and who can forget the real Adrian Cronauer saying about the movie, my name is Adrian Cronauer, and I did serve in Vietnam, and sort of implying that that's about as much as they got right. And Argo, where pretty much the entire last third of the film is completely fictitious. Oh, definitely Kingdom of Heaven. Do you know what, Seth? Have a listen to the back catalogue. Let us know what you think. And anyone else who's interested, Let us know which movie we've covered that had you thinking, wow, they got that so wrong. We also had a very timely email from Charles Kingan in South Africa, timely as he found us through Des's last appearance on HBH when we covered Breaker Morant. He writes, Dear Andrew and Martin, I'm another South African who found you when you asked Des Latham to join you for your Breaker Morant episode. Since then, I've been dipping into your back catalogue, finding them all well researched and presented. They make my daily exercise period of 100 laps around and around my house during lockdown a little more interesting. Through your introduction, I've also found Sean Munger's Second Decade, a very interesting series indeed. Thank you. I see you have Invictus planned for a future. Maybe you could consider Cry Freedom too. It's the story of Donald Woods, a newspaper editor in the late 70s of apartheid South Africa, who had many dealings with Steve Biko and suffered from the machinations of the South African security police. It starred Denzel Washington and Kevin Kline and was directed by Richard Attenborough. Perhaps it's a little niche for your global audience, but then Invictus is similar, although it does have the pull of Mandela. Keep up the good work. Regards, Charles. Well, I'm delighted to reveal, Charles, that not only are we keen to cover both of those movies, but we're confident that we've recruited Des Latham to join us yet again to help give a local perspective to the movies and the people and events that inspired them. I think they're very universal themes. Certainly Cry Freedom. Despite being a fairly keen sports fan, I haven't seen Invictus. The image I most clearly recall from the 1995 Rugby World Cup was the semi-final and Jonah Lomu running through Mike Catt, the England fullback, like he was a newly planted shrub. I was then amazed but delighted that South Africa were able to beat the seemingly invincible New Zealand All Blacks in the final. But as a Brit, I didn't fully realise the galvanising effect the victory had on the nation, and just entering their second year of Mandela's presidency. So, yeah, definitely two more for us. Hopefully sometime this year we'll get to those. Before that, however, we do have a few other shows to bring you. The next one up, and there has been for those who closely follow the planned episodes page on the website, the next one, there's been a lot of chopping and changing as people's schedules are messed around through no fault of their own by circumstances outside their control. And for example, Andrew, even though he is in lockdown, he's in Melbourne, but working for a university in Brisbane, has been given a project which is taking pretty much every waking moment. And he was saying the problem is when you don't go into an office, there's no clearly defined start and end to your workday. So he's finding that he's actually working really, really long hours and weekends as well. We are going to get Andrew back for the next episode, which will be The Coal Miner's Daughter, the story of Loretta Lynn. Sorry to those who aren't too fond of the Boy's Own Adventure type movies. And Susan Jones, I'm not saying you're not fond of them, but I do know that you were the one who just nudged us towards trying to broaden our range a little bit more. And that's something we're still very, very grateful for. As Gary Shavit said, The Coal Miner's Daughter won't take too much deep thought. But it really is an entertaining movie. I watched it a couple of times in the last couple of weeks for the research and really, really enjoyed it. After that, we're going to turn to 1988's Young Guns, the story of Billy the Kid and his regulators. And for that, we're going to be joined by Chris Wimmer, writer and host of both the Legends of the Old West and Infamous America podcast shows. Chris has a host of great stories to tell. Recently did a series on Billy the Kid, so we were delighted when he agreed to join us to cover the movie. We originally intended to produce a joint show with Zulu Dawn and Young Guns, which, considering that Billy the Kid was in mid-crime career when the events in Zulu Dawn occurred, we could have called the 1879 episode. But, as you're about to hear, I had so much fun with Des that this show is going to be over 2 hours, so we'll leave Young Guns till early June. We don't yet have definite publication dates for Coal Miner's Daughter or Young Guns, but if you keep an eye on the planned episodes page, which is also the homepage of the website, historybyhollywood.com, we'll post the dates there as soon as we know them. And now, let's meet Des Latham for his second visit to HBH, where we're going to talk about the drama of Isandhlwana as we examine the movie Zulu Dawn. So I'm absolutely delighted once again to welcome on board Des Latham. Des is the South African host of the Anglo-Boer War Podcast series, and he came on with us to talk about Breaker Morant back last autumn. And he's agreed to join us again. Des, thank you so much, and we hope you're keeping safe and well in these difficult times. How are you?
Very well, thank you so much for having me back. I thought I would have driven you away with my rambling last time, so thanks very much. We shut down like most of the world, and our COVID-19 numbers are lowish. We've got 150 odd dead at the moment. And considering we started at the same numbers as the US at the beginning of March, we're doing pretty well, but we are kind of worried about, we're going to stage 4 in a 5-stage process, so we opened up a few things on May 1st, so we're a bit concerned to see the effect of that. It may come back, but we're in a long haul here, aren't we?
No, absolutely, and as we were saying before we started the recording, you know, when we come out, I think the world may look quite different to what we used to. As for ramblings, I mean, that is what we do. That's our USP on here, I think, with the Rambling podcast. And I'm not talking about people going for a nice walk in the countryside. So you have been hosting the Anglo-Boer War Podcast, and I love the way that basically the week that happened in 1902, you report on that in the corresponding week here, and very gladly for the people who went through that kind of really avoidable and tragic war, but sadly for us, we are coming to the end, and I was hoping you might have another project you're planning to do.
Yes, I've got a couple of ideas. One is that I may actually continue. I've been receiving a lot of comments from the audience, which is really heartening. After 3 years, you think they've kind of had enough, but they're saying, no, listen, there's a lot more to talk about here. So I may actually continue with looking at individuals who were involved, because of course most of the First World War generals on the British side went through the Anglo-Boer War, including Haig and others. So I may follow their trails further, and in terms of inside South Africa, there was of course the 1914 uprising. De Wet and others who were generals in the Boer War rose up because Smuts and Burt, who joined the British, had become more Anglicized by then, supported the First World War, the British in the First World War, and the other rebels supported the Germans. So they went back to war basically, and in fact, De Wet was shot at a roadblock by his own people, by Afrikaans armed men shot him at a roadblock when he tried to drive past, and it's quite a vicious story. So I'm going to continue with that. Probably do twice a month instead of weekly. Then I've got a podcast series on Stalingrad, which I'm starting in June.
Wow.
June 22nd, which I'm going to cover, first of all, the start of Barbarossa and just paint the picture, because you can't really just jump into Stalingrad without some kind of pictures, drawing up the analogies and really putting things in place before you get to August of 1942, which is when Hitler started focusing really on Stalingrad. And then I've got my Plane Crash Diaries podcast, which I do once or twice a month. And as I said to you before we started, I've had an issue with that because of COVID-19. So it's really a series about improved aviation safety based on incidents and accidents. But it felt a bit hollow. A couple of months ago, I started doing 1 or 2 more on COVID. And so that's kind of underway as well. So yeah, it's been busy.
Wow. I did not know about the ongoing conflict in South Africa after the end, with the First World War, and yet that's the problem, I think, when we look at a period, and historians will decide that the Third Punic War went from 248 to 271 BC or whatever it is, and we talk about the 100 Years' War and we think, well, it wasn't actually a continual war. The state of war was there. It was the Wars of the Roses that we looked at the beginning of the year with Derek Burks, and he said it's some battles that happened over a period of 15, 20 years, but it wasn't continual. And then we have a beginning and an end, and of course it's so difficult because there's a context that leads into that situation, and then there are repercussions afterwards. And the people living at it certainly wouldn't have said, right, well, that's that over, and now let's move on to the next thing. It doesn't work like that.
No.
So we will start off, as ever, with the story of the movie. So this movie, Zulu Dawn, released in 1979, 15 years after the better-known Zulu, even though it's a prequel. So the movie was written by Cy Enfield, who directed Zulu, and the cast, I mean, it's pretty stellar. You've got Hollywood legend Burt Lancaster, alongside British heavyweights Peter O'Toole, Sir John Mills and Denholm Elliott. We have Bob Hoskins playing a grizzled company sergeant major or colour sergeant. Simon Ward as a young gentleman officer, and a wide range of other British veterans of stage, screen and TV. The movie was filmed in South Africa, still under the yoke of apartheid, and the movie was beset by problems. An early one was John Hurt, who many people know. He was the Elephant Man. He was the man in Alien who was first eaten from the inside out by the alien. And he'd been cast in a leading role, but he was refused entry into South Africa, possibly because the authorities may have confused him with actor and political activist and conscientious objector John Hurd, as in herd of cattle, not hurt, as in ouch, that hurt. Burt Lancaster's agent insisted that Jake Eberts, a Canadian film producer and financier who was involved in raising funds for the movie, should guarantee Lancaster's fee. To do this, Ebert took out a loan, the interest on which meant that by 1983, he owed £450,000, pounds, and it took him years to pay it back. The budget was over $11 million. The movie failed to make its money back at the box office, and it's very, very difficult. I've not been able to find out what it made, but it was a huge failure financially, and it was panned by critics. Rotten Tomatoes rates it at 57% from critics and only 62% from audiences. Although when you read the audience reviews, this modest score is surprising, because most recent reviews say the movie's well made and balanced. A common criticism by the critics, by the professional critics, is the battle scenes are dramatic but devoid of emotion or empathy for either side. We'll no doubt discuss that as we go along. The score was written by Elmer Bernstein, the legendary Hollywood composer. He'd written scores for over 150 movies, famously including The Magnificent Seven and The Great Escape, both of whose main themes have become classics in their own right. And personally, I mean, I'd argue it's a far more realistic and insightful movie than many made of Britain's colonial history. And Peter O'Toole's Lord Chelmsford can err on the side of pantomime villain, but there is a refreshing humanity from both some British characters and Zulus, particularly the depiction of King Cetshwayo, played by Simon Sabela, as a reasonably wise ruler seeking to avoid confrontation whilst refusing to completely submit to some pretty unreasonable British demands. I mean, certainly you grew up in that environment, Des. You know an awful lot more about this than I do, and I'm just wondering if before we go into the detail of the movie, if your feeling of the mood of it is that it captured it pretty well.
Well, from my youth, Cetshwayo was loved and respected, and he was caught in a situation that he could not escape. And so for both the white farmers who I grew up with and also the Zulu people, he was highly regarded as someone who did as much as he could to avoid actually going to war. So the narrative is pretty correct from both sides of the spectrum, if you like. The overall action, the Zulus, when they went into action, they weren't very emotional. They were very, very focused. And so you wouldn't find them screaming, and the only noises they would make would be the sound of bees. They made a noise like humming sounds. So when you had 20,000 of them, which there were there, going bzzz together or sound like that, it has a really chilling effect on an enemy. They didn't, they didn't cry out when they were struck. They were trained to do that. They didn't scream if they were shot or stabbed. They were pretty silent. And the British on the other side were also stoic, weren't they? I mean, they were trained not to show any fear whatsoever. So I think that criticism is kind of very wide of the mark if you understand the culture at the time and on both sides. They weren't going to be shouting and screaming and crying like babies. They were going to be, as stern and as silent as possible, given the noises the Zulu were making and the orders. The British were told to shut up and listen to orders. They wouldn't have, called out, crying for mummy. They would have listened for the sergeant or the officers' commands.
One of the many books I've read about the conflict between the British and the Zulus over the years described the Zulus, as Africa's Spartans, and you do get that sense of a very militaristic, very regimented. You don't show pain, you don't show weakness, you never surrender, you never leave the battlefield unless you're ordered to do so. And you kind of get that whole warrior ethos thing that they do seem to be set apart from, maybe other African tribes' approach to warfare.
Yeah, I mean, that has been overplayed a little over time, but there's no doubt about it. I mean, the training was severe. There were many Zulus who did flee the battlefield, but the punishment for that, there were 3 forms of punishment, and which was far worse than being stabbed in the heart of a battle. The one was being placed, being stripped, and then having a sharp stick shoved up your behind until you died. So that, and they knew that was the punishment, the main punishment for cowardice. So that tended to apply to the cowards' minds, at least. But given that, there were still examples of entire clans refusing to fight and so on. So that's been slightly overplayed, as these things are. But there's no doubt about it. The Zulus were trained at a much, much higher level in military matters than most of the clans around them. And in the end, they were quite... they caused a lot of dislocation in the east of South Africa over from the early 1800s, when it was actually not the Zulu. We're nowhere near the biggest group in the area. It was Mtetwa and a few others groups that were highly militarized, and the Zulu just continued with that tradition. So the Zulu became what we know today as the Zulu, but it's slightly deceptive. The Zulu came from a small group called the Kwabe, which was a tiny little clan in a small valley, which is literally where I grew up.
Right.
I grew up in literally the middle of where the Zulu started. And now we know as the Zulu as 10 million people living in that province in South Africa, in the KwaZulu-Natal province. It developed over time. But the fact that their kinship system was not broken by the British, that's true. Their military system was shaken by colonialism, but it was not broken, and it continues to this day. And because of that, our country at times has been affected by that, in recent times too, by militarization in the Zulu culture.
With the movie going into the opening scenes, we get opening titles telling us that in 1879, the British colony of Natal is surrounded by a vast Zulu empire, and that the future of both is about to be changed by a great battle, Isandhlwana. And then the opening scenes have a Zulu kraal with a mass of warriors and women performing ceremonial dances before their king, Cetshwayo. And then we cut to the High Commissioner's residence in Natal, and this is very typical. It wouldn't have looked out of place in India, or maybe, a rich plantation in, Carolina in America or something. And we meet Lord Chelmsford, played by Peter O'Toole, and Commissioner Sir Henry Bartle Frere, played by Sir John Mills. And they're drafting a series of demands for King Cetshwayo. And we've just got a clip with the ultimatum that they're discussing.
Cetshwayo's Zulu army to disband, and the warriors permitted to return to their homes. Present military system to be abandoned. New regulations concerning the defense of the realm worked out. All who do not submit will be dealt with as enemies of the crown. We will not permit the arbitrary killing and unjust oppression which the Zulu people have suffered from their own king, Cetshwayo. You will see from the letter that this ultimatum is our decision alone. Her Majesty's government seems to prefer a negotiated settlement. Does this do what we both know to be right, Frederick?
It does, Sir Henry. Excellently.
So we can see that these rather Machiavellian men, the civilian governor, Bartle Frere, and the military commander, Lord Chelmsford, Lieutenant General Chelmsford, by Peter O'Toole, as we mentioned, they're trying to make sure that they create a situation where they can justify we've entered into an attack in self-defense. As the Romans once said, they conquered the world in self-defense. In the movie, the next day, we see troops being paraded, both British and African troops, and we meet Colour Sergeant Williams, played by Bob Hoskins, and he's berating a Private Williams and then directing some Boer volunteers to where they can sign up to fight the Zulu. Some African cavalry arrive, led by the veteran of South African campaigning, Lieutenant Colonel Durnford. He's played by Burt Lancaster, complete with a slightly iffy Irish accent. His troops, the Sikali Horse, show themselves to be adept riders and marksmen with a flamboyant display. And we do hear a little bit of snobbery from Colonel Crelock, who is Lord Chelmsford's military secretary, who questions why every member of the Sikali Horse has a rifle, where the stipulation is that native troops are given one rifle between 10 men and only 5 rounds per rifle, which seems a bit ridiculous, but there you go. We also meet Lieutenant Verica. Simon Ward it plays this part. He's a gentleman-looking chap in suit and hat, introduces himself to Durnford and asked if he can be recruited to a post. After a display of horsemanship and riding skill, he's recruited, and we also realise that he speaks Zulu, or he speaks the native tongues. Taken to the officers' mess, Verica also shows himself to be on first-name terms with Lord Chelmsford. He reveals he's been farming near Zululand, and he says he had to choose between fighting for Britain or the Zulu. It's not clear if this is a joke. His family are also revealed to be aristocracy, his father sitting in the House of Lords, as pointed out by a few sneering young officers, prominent amongst them Lieutenants Melville and Coghill. So we've met a lot of people in the opening scenes, and we've seen straight away things are afoot. So, how did they do? You've got some comments to make on some of those characters, I believe.
Yeah, I do. I mean, first of all, Dunn was the farmer they're talking about, was one of the farmers, and John Dunn was famous for marrying into the Zulu royal family. He had dozens of Zulu wives, and in fact his descendants, mixed-race descendants in South Africa, are vast, and many of them live in the area still, in Ishawi, for example, which is up the road from Ulundi. So I thought that was the part that they were trying to play, because he was vacillating between helping Cetshwayo because of his relationship he had with the Zulus, and also he was British. So he had a real contradiction built into him. And of course, he was not just, he didn't just speak Zulu, his children were part Zulu. So I think that's the person. But the fact that they preferred not to write in a mixed race family, I guess, and also a farmer who was given land by Cetshwayo and by his predecessor Mpande, I think is indicative of the time.
Yeah.
The mid-70s, writing in the mid-70s. So that's one thing. The second thing is that, Bartle Frere was definitely trying to concoct a confederacy of states in South Africa. He wanted the Zulus to fail. And he wanted to, make almost like a Canada out of South Africa, with Carnarvon, who at the time was kind of mobilizing behind the scenes in Britain. So Frere, he's got a couple of towns named after him in South Africa, but he was definitely doing exactly what he was displayed as doing in the movie, which was kind of conspiring. How much Chelmsford was involved in that, I'm not sure. It's not really clear.
I mean, I don't know a lot about Bartle Frere. I have read him described as an expert colonial troubleshooter, and he would be sent round the empire where, as he was seen as cunning sounds. If you say someone's cunning, it's quite pejorative, and I don't think he was viewed like that by the establishment, by the government. But I do think he was used as we need someone who's actually going to get things done. And there's almost a suggestion that he was sent to South Africa with, officially, you are to go there and try and avoid confrontation with anybody. Unofficially, sort it out. It's one of those almost read between the lines of your instructions, please, which he did. Now, whether Disraeli's government actually wanted him to go and create a war, we're not sure, and it's been partly said to have brought about the downfall of Disraeli's government. Chelmsford, I've read, it was a very effective battlefield commander when he could see what was going on, but he was not very good at broader strategies. Now, that's been written, obviously, in the aftermath of the disaster, which this movie portrays. So, completely underestimating the capabilities of the Zulu impis to move their mobility. And one of the books I've read about this said, some people would say, thank goodness he wasn't born 40 years later with modern warfare, where generals very rarely could see the entire battlefield. He would have been far more suited to a medieval army. But yeah, I don't think he was quite as political a creature as suggested here.
I agree with you. I think that he was a military person first. And I don't think Bartle Frere needed Chelmsford. Chelmsford needed Bartle Frere in a way, because Frere did not inform the British government he was going to give an ultimatum to Cetshwayo. And so, Disraeli may have protected Frere later, but Disraeli didn't know. And whether or not it was conspiratorial, don't tell me, I don't want to know, but go ahead and do it kind of action, has been debated since then. I think we've just got to look at the facts here and say that Frere was working on a broader idea politically. Chelmsford was not really interested in that. Chelmsford was interested in his own military future. It was in the military. He was not going to become a politician. And he probably just thought this was a way in which he could make a name for himself. He could take over and destroy this warlike people called the Zulu, and he'd be famous forever. Or infamous as he is now, which of course he had no idea that would lead to him becoming, recognized as the commander of Isandhlwana. But I mean, Chelmsford was also a man of his time, which we have to say. I know sometimes it's incorrect to say that, but he was trained to do certain things by the military at the time, and he did what he was trained to do.
Yeah, and I think possibly when you've got Peter O'Toole in your cast, the sinister way in that little scene we played when Bartle Frere says to him, does this achieve what we both know to be right, Frederick? And he says, it does, Sir Henry, excellently. And it's so sort of, picture in the Kevin Costner Robin Hood, I can't believe I'm going to forget his name now.
Alan Rickman.
Thank you, Des. Yeah.
Vaguely from the depths of the memory cells that emerged.
Well done. Yeah, Alan Rickman, what a fantastic actor. But Peter O'Toole, very good at that sort of thing. So back to the movie, and the action cuts back to Cetshwayo's kraal, where there's something akin to a gladiatorial contest taking place between two warriors surrounded by, hundreds of their fellow warriors cheering them on. And we see a messenger arrive. He's a very tough-looking veteran Zulu warrior, but he's working for the British. And he approaches Cetshwayo, and he makes several demands about stopping border incursions and how the Zulus should run their kingdom. Cetshwayo commits that he will not cross the river that divides their lands. I believe it's the Buffalo River. But then he says, do I go to the land of the white man and tell him how to live his life? At which point we cut back to Natal, where officers and ladies are enjoying a garden party. It's all very Victorian. Frere and Chelmsford finalise their plans. They're joined by Lieutenant Colonel Crelock, Chelmsford's military secretary, as they gossip about Colonel Durnford and his wife back in England, who they believe exists, but no one's sort of seen her for years. And Durnford appears to be with another lady, one Fanny Colenso, daughter of the Bishop of Natal, Bishop Colenso. And then a discussion ensues about the likelihood of a Zulu invasion of Natal. And we've got another clip.
Ah, General. Do you find our border country congenial, my lord?
Landscape most congenial, ma'am, but the border vulnerable.
Do you really think Cetshwayo will attack us?
The intention of the Zulu impi and their king concern me deeply.
Cetshwayo has no intention of attacking Natal, Mrs. Pretorius, unless he's given no option. He has no quarrel with us.
How rare to meet a young lady interested in tactical matters, Mr. Lindsay.
Is it not, Sir Henry, most rare?
You are talking of a violent and murdering barbarian who commands an army of 30,000 warriors just across the river.
My father has known and lived with the Zulus for many years.
Cetshwayo massacred 20,000 of his own people to make himself king.
The English Tudor kings did no less. Much later in our nation's history, I might add, and the French much more recently.
That may well be, Your Grace, but be that as it may, my duty is clear. The defense of all this. Natal.
Yes. Well, it's difficult to stand against that position. If you speak only of defense.
So they have this discussion, and you can see there are people on both sides of the fence, as there always will be. As the party continues, the Zulu messenger we saw earlier at Cetshwayo's kraal returns and speaks to Frere. He then calls for quiet and announces that due to Cetshwayo's refusal to accept their ultimatum, there now exists a state of war between Britain and the Zulu nation. The announcement is not universally popular. The Bishop of Natal, for one, decrying the situation, saying this beautiful land is surely big enough for both groups. Well, let's go back to Cetshwayo's kraal. Yeah, the military contest, I mean, it ends with one of the combatants being killed by the other, almost like a gladiatorial thumbs down from the emperor.
Yeah, I mean, that's very... I grew up doing stick fighting, and it's very dangerous. Stick fighting continues to this day in parts of KwaZulu-Natal, and people do die.
Wow.
In this, and you have people fighting with one hand as a knob carry, or in the lesser fights you use just two sticks. If you get hit in the head with that, it can kill you. So that's not a long shot, and if you look at the time as well, people were practicing there. But I must say that that's very accurate, because what happened is Cetshwayo had called the Indunas around because it was close to the first fruit ceremony, part of the harvest.
Yeah.
And it would Ulundi would not have always looked that busy. There were always things going on, but not the numbers there. But what the British didn't know, or they seem to have kind of underestimated, is that ironically, at the same time as they decided to invade, Cetshwayo had called the first fruits. So all his main Indunas and chiefs and his many of his impis actually had gathered, at Ulundi at the same time as this whole ultimatum started becoming kind of knowledge and public knowledge. And of course, as we know, he ignored the first ultimatum until late December, and then ignored the second until January, when the decision was taken to invade. So that's pretty accurate, that whole representation.
Right, and Cetshwayo does seem to have been really accommodating, but at the same time, quite understandably, refusing to completely prostrate himself and accept all these demands, some of which really politically he was unable to make, which I assume was Bartle Frere's intention all along. He knew that he couldn't accept all these demands.
Of course not. I mean, the one thing we must state here is that it's a bit of a myth that the Zulu were predating around the place. They weren't. They'd learned from Shaka's era. Shaka made some major mistakes in the 1820s. One is that he overstretched his military. They couldn't even go as far south as the present day the Xhosa speakers live in the Transkei Quarter. He couldn't go across the Umzimkhulu River, which is just south of Durban. His impis were taken out. He couldn't even attack into Basutoland, which is on the border of Zululand, on the west side of the border of Zululand. The Xhosa, which is a clan that ran away from him with some of the animals, he failed to subject them to his rule. He also failed to subject the Kiswati, the Swazis, to the north, and the Mzilikazi of the Ndebele people. So it's a bit of a myth that this, here was the Zulu, they were going to cause damage and chaos. And all the people living in Natal at the time, most of them knew this. They knew that the Zulu were, at times they were stealing cattle, and they were a force not to be taken lightly, but they were not going to be invading in any great number to take on the British Empire to the south. I mean, that was just complete, way out there kind of concept, even at the time.
Yeah.
But a lot of colonials wanted that narrative because they wanted the land. They wanted to go into the land. So, but the reality was, Colenso knew that Cetshwayo was bending over backwards, and Frances, his daughter, who had a relationship of some sort, did also had lived amongst the Zulu and knew that they were not going to be crossing over the Buffalo River to the west and over the Tugela River, which is the other river to the south towards present-day Durban. They were going to stay right where they were and not fiddle around with the British Empire.
No. And clearly he's been sent this ultimatum with a fairly restrictive time limit on it, to which he's clearly chosen not to respond, at least not positively. And it's ironic. I mean, this is happening in the same decade as 3 years before we've seen Custer and the Battle of Little Bighorn. And again, you look at the North Plains Indians, the Sioux, and it's, we'll make an agreement. Oh, no, we want this now. So you ask for more and you ask for more and you ask for more. And you engineer a situation where really you force them into either complete subjugation or war. And obviously, as Custer and Chelmsford both confident that they could see that to a successful conclusion, which Chelmsford eventually did. And obviously Custer was buried, but we'll come back to Chelmsford. Yeah. So back to the movie, we see the British troops deploying at night, and we meet a few more characters. The Quartermaster Sergeant Bloomfield, played by Peter Vaughan, who would be much remembered from the Ronnie Barker comedy series Porridge. He was the big bad boss in the prison. He was played by Peter Vaughan. And Private Pullen, his lad, his boy, played by a young Phil Daniels, who, if anyone's seen Quadrophenia, Phil Daniels was the lead character Jimmy in Quadrophenia, but that's just a bit of movie trivia. We learn that whilst Lieutenant Vereker will take the Sicali horse with the marching column, Lieutenant Colonel Durnford, much to his disgust, has been told to remain in Natal with the rest of the Natal native contingent and to guard the river crossings, and he's not happy about this deployment. At the camp at Rorke's Drift, we see the column crossing into Zululand, rafts being pulled across the river packed with red-coated infantry and cavalry and horse artillery, swimming their horses across or pulling the guns through shallow fords. Orderly lines of white bell tents spring up as camp is set, and smart pith-helmeted horsemen trot across the dramatic countryside, and we have a jaunty tune from Elmer Bernstein escort or accompanying the scene. Lieutenant Vereker is approached by one Norris Norris Newman, a newspaper reporter for The Standard, to talk about their prospects. Noggs, played by Ronald Lacey, in a slightly slimy way, will be accompanying the column on his march into Zululand. We then have Noggs meeting Lord Chelmsford. So we've got a clip. It's actually a clip of Chelmsford and Creelock speaking, and then you'll hear Noggs introduce himself.
What's that strange name the newspaper chaps called?
They're called Noggs, sir. Actual name is Norris Newman. He presented credentials from the Standard.
Our runners bear his dispatches, do they not?
Of course, sir.
Excuse me, my lord. Norris Newman of the Standard, my lord.
I saw you lead our cavalry, sir.
Indeed, I did, my lord. I was one of the first to cross.
Were they in good heart as they entered enemy territory?
They spurred onto the high ground, my lord, full of spirit and looking for the Zulu. Full of sport they were, my lord.
Tell what you see. Write it well, sir. And make sure you get it right.
If I got it right, my lord, you lead an invasion into Zululand. Oh, I see it all around me. But why is the question my readers will ask. Why?
Do not confuse yourself. Why? We must strike a heavy blow. This cannot be a war of maneuver.
So, attack is your defense. Well, let's hope Chetsueo will offer his impis for destruction.
My only fear is that the Zulu will avoid engagement.
So for that reality bit, we'll just wrap up with Charles Noggs Norris Newman first. He was indeed a reporter for the Standard newspaper, and he wrote a book about his experiences accompanying Lord Chelmsford for the campaign, slightly unimaginatively titled On Campaign with the British Army in the Zulu War of 1879. He did very well out of the book.
Very search engine optimized. Sorry to butt in, but I was just saying that's a very search engine optimized title, I must tell you, for modern
Isn't
world.
it just? Yeah, 100 years before, 130 years before Amazon would appear. He already had a very well... you can still get it. You can get Kindle edition, you can get paperback, hardback. We will put a link to the Amazon page for that in case anybody's interested. I've got a book, and it's field reports with commentary written at the time of the by officers serving with the British Army on that campaign, and it's fascinating to read the language of the time. It's there are some who you sense it's like having a conversation, like telling their mate at the pub, and then there's others that clearly fancy themselves as you know, the next William Shakespeare or something. They're trying to write in very highfalutin language, but it's interesting. And yeah, Norris Newman was definitely a sceptical, not necessarily cynical, but a sceptical observer, which is quite well portrayed by those clips. Go on, give us the overview of, because there was a lot more going on in the British campaign than just what we see in this movie, isn't it? The implication is the entire army is with Lord Chelmsford, whereas actually that's not the case.
Yeah, there were 5 columns for a start, and he was in column 3. He was in charge of column 3, which had about, if you look at the numbers there, 2,500 odd, broken up into smaller units at times. So yes, I mean, part of the column, there was a 3-phase attack, almost like the Zulus themselves. There was one column that was sent to the coast. There was one that had skirted Zululand and was going to arrive from the northwest and drive through to Uluni, and then of course the main column, and then there were 2 others that were left on border duty. One of them is Durnford, as you mentioned, but he ended up joining joining Isandhlwana at the camp, unfortunately for the members of that column. But just in terms of also the filming of them crossing the river, the rivers were in spate at the time. They were much, much stronger than they look like in the movie. South Africa's rivers, they go from meandering around they go from literally a few feet deep to 30 feet deep in less than an hour or two, and they can stay like that in the rainy season for a few months. So, and that's why, yeah, it's incredible to see, and that's why, because it's very steeply rising eastern coast that we have. The hinterland rises very, very steeply, and there's a huge amount of rainfalls. We're talking about 40, 50, 60 millimeters sometimes in an hour. So these rivers turn into, really dangerous rivers, and that didn't really show you really effectively how dangerous it was for porters to drown. And it happened regularly. And as I said to you in the notes that we were exchanging, the experienced African travelers would not really want to move around at that point in time. They would kind of want to get somewhere and then maybe not camp for a while and wait for the river to drop before crossing it. I think the British underestimated that side of it too.
Yeah, and back in the movie, I mean, Major Harford, who strikes us as a decent man, he sees a drowned porter on the riverside and he's horrified. And Quartermaster Bloomfield is removing the man's bandolier, and Harford says, "This is terrible, what a waste," talking about the loss of human life. And Bloomfield says, "Well, these rounds have got to be accounted for." As the British troops deploy towards an escarpment, having crossed the river, a shot rings out and we hear a voice call down to the troops. And just for the drama of this voice, I'm not sure if this really happened, and I'm going to ask you about that in the moment, but we have got this little clip again.
Why do you come to the land of the Zulu?
May I answer, sir?
By all means, Mr. Melville.
We come here by the orders of the great Queen Victoria, Queen of all Africa.
So after that, knowing that there are Zulus present, the cavalry surge up the hill, and a small group of Zulu scouts is their target. The Sakali horse are first into action, and Lieutenant Verica and his African cavalry overrunning the escaping Zulu scouts, though not without casualties themselves. A troop of lancers also get on the action, spearing one warrior against a tree. Noggs, the reporter, though, is less than impressed, seeing that the Zulu is at least a grandfather. He says, "If this was a warrior in his prime, I'd lay odds against your lancer, Mr. Melville." King Ketchweo, meanwhile, addresses his assembled impis, the regiments, back at his kraal, telling them the British have broken their promises and crossed into Zululand, and they have to fight to survive. He's greeted by enthusiastic war cries. Meanwhile, we meet Lieutenant Colonel Pulaine, played by Denholm Elliott, and he's ordered to take his 1st Battalion of the 24th Regiment of Foot to the slopes of a hill called Isandhlwana, a name he struggles to pronounce. The rest of the column will join him before they advance further into Zululand on the hunt for the impis. Coghill and Melville, the two young officers, enthuse about this great adventure upon which they have embarked. So we've talked about the river, and the Natal native contingent are worth a mention, because they had some good success at times, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, they portrayed as kind of as lacking in courage and running away. And that's for later, we'll discuss it during the battle, what happened there. But they were Zulu. 2,700 of them were part of the whole column, or number of columns going in. They were mainly armed with assegais, and a few had rifles. That was how they traveled, because there just weren't enough rifles. And secondly, they weren't trained really to shoot rifles, but they were a Zulu, part of the Zulu clan that had been fighting. Remember, I mentioned Cetshwayo and other leaders always had opposition within the Zulu and the vast clan system. So but that was not unusual. It turned into the situation later where they would be killed for being traitors, but as far as they were concerned, they were fighting for their chief, who was against Cetshwayo, and the whites and the British just happened to be another clan in the area. That's how they regarded them. They weren't fearful of the British as much as been stated. So they were pretty much operating as a Zulu small column alongside the English, alongside the British. You mustn't see them as like the British army there. It was the Zulu working with the British, a part of the Zulu kinship system. A part of the Zulu people were working with the British against the other part of the Zulu. That's one of the difficult things to understand here, is that it's not a single large entity called the Zulu. It was many, many, many clans. And as I explained to you, the Zulu in oral tradition were relatively recent as a powerful entity. The Xwabe and the Mtetwa and so on are much, much more important in the long-term history of that area.
So almost when we talk about Italy pre-Garibaldi, it's actually a grouping or a lot of independent city-states who sometimes would be allied and sometimes would be at war with each other, rather than one homogenous country.
Yeah, precisely. The problem with this story is that people look at it from the prism of the present. So it's about white versus black. It's about the Zulu working together to fight against colonialism and so on. That's a myth. It was much more complex on the ground. People were forming allegiances as powerful leaders of their own people, whether they were white traders or black chiefs. They were doing deals and so on. So it's very simplistic and typical of modern historians, I think, in a way, to say, they were naughty because they worked with the English and they were kind of traitors to the cause. There was no cause. They were working with the cause of their chief, the Nduna, who said, I don't like Cetshwayo. There's my chance to work with someone else for the moment. They'll be gone too, like the rest of them. That was kind of the logic of the time. So they were armed and dangerous. They were well trained as Zulus. They were seeking treasure and they wanted to get involved.
Yeah, I mean, I always love that line of Lieutenant Ardendorff in the original film Zulu, where Lieutenant Bromhead says, but they can't have, good God, man, there were 1,200, British troops at Isandhlwana. They can't have been defeated. And Ardendorff says there were 700 NNC as well, Native Natal contingent. And Bromhead says, oh, damn, they're more cowardly blacks. And Ardendorff just looks at him and says, who do you think's coming to wipe out your command? The Grenadier Guards? It's like, and that kind of just casual, sometimes patronisingly paternalistic and condescending, and sometimes really dismissive. And it's also worth pointing out that the portrayal of the 24th Regiment of Foot, who would subsequently go on to become the South Wales Borderers, by 1979, they've obviously realised they weren't Welsh. I imagine a lot of historians after Zulu came out and said, the thing with the choir and Men of Harlech, lovely. Yeah, they weren't Welsh. And one of the reasons, because they were the 2nd Warwickshire Regiment, I think, is where the 24th of Foot were drawn from, but they'd moved their depot back in the UK to Brecon, which is in Wales. Because they lost so many men at Isandhlwana, they then had to recruit replacements. Because they were in Wales, then they did become a very Welsh regiment, and they are now part of what used to be the Royal Regiment of Wales, the South Wales Borderers. So they have a Welsh heritage, but that started, I think, in 1881, 1882, not in 1879. So at least they've got that bit right. Yeah, the Chelmsford inspecting Isandhlwana.
He inspects the hill, but they didn't actually film at the mountain in the movie itself. When he inspects there, I felt a bit sorry for Chelmsford when you look at the facts, because I mean he had 170 odd wagons that he was trying to corral and to move around the veldt, and he needed an area pretty much. If you look at Isandhlwana field, it's the size of probably 20 football fields, back to back.
Wow.
And he didn't need that much space, but he needed space to see what was going on outside of it. So, but he did need a large area for his wagons to park. And if you look at the territory, it's quite hilly in places. There are many dongas and dry riverbeds, and you can't really site your camp in anywhere else but where he sited it. Very little chance of, given the time that he had and the space and so on, he didn't really have that many options. So I felt a bit sorry for him, because he ignored some of the advice, which we know, but also he really had to get a large open field, and this was it.
So back in the movie, we now cut to up country, where we see a Boer farmer riding his horse, followed by some native porters with his baggage or possibly his produce atop their heads. The farmer sees some cattle and herders in a gully and shouts down to them. They run off, and suddenly he sees that his porters have dropped their loads and legged it. They're just running away down the hill. Looking back over his shoulder, he then sees a vast Zulu impi flowing over a ridge. He turns his horse and canters off himself. A Zulu commander tells 3 warriors to follow him, to allow themselves to be caught and interrogated, and then, when the British think they're broken, to tell them that the impis are in the east. They unhesitatingly obey. And one of these warriors we earlier saw in a scene calling Cetshwayo father, so we can assume that he's maybe one of Cetshwayo's sons. The farmer is seen by Lieutenant Rorke in a patrol of the Sakali horse, and they hear some shots. He's firing over his shoulder at the pursuing Zulus. They rescue the terrified man and capture the warriors. The farmer claims, sort of fairly typically, he says, dozens of Zulus chased me, I must have shot 5, 6, maybe 10. Rorke nearly smiles in response, but then he is shocked when the farmer says, there's a huge impi over the hill coming this way. We then see the camp at Isandhlwana, where Lieutenant Rorke is speaking with Colonel Pauline about the possible sighting of the impi. The Boer we saw earlier being recruited, not the farmer, but the guy we saw back at the start of the movie, he's desperately trying to talk to Pauline. He says, you must circle your wagons, you must create a laager if you're to camp on an open slope. But at that point, Lord Chelmsford arrives and dismisses the man's caution, saying, I've got far too many wagons, and he has total confidence in the British soldiers' firepower. The prisoners are now being beaten and confess that they're deserters from the main impi in the east. This contradicts the Boer farmer's assertion, but Chelmsford appears more inclined to believe the Zulus and decides to march towards the royal kraal at Ulundi and the east. He says to the farmer, you can accompany me. And the farmer says, no, I'm just a farmer, I'm not a soldier. And he says, well, you can accompany me or you can be arrested. So let's just wrap that little bit up. Yeah, the bit about the Boer farmer, we're not sure if that's strictly true, but you do have some background on the word Boers there, who obviously would have had intimate knowledge of the Zulus and what precautions should be taken.
Well, I'm not aware that any farmer per se was co-opted in such a manner as described in the movie. But we know that Paul Kruger, who was a young leader of the Boers at the time, did send a message to Chelmsford saying, do not make the mistake of not forming a laager when you camp. The Zulus will attack you in force and in numbers. And there were a number of other warnings from Dutch farmers in the area at the time. But I'm not aware of it happening on the day or the day before. It was sometime before the invasion. Where he had got word from Kruger in a letter, actually, and a message basis saying, you have to take precautions here. These people will come and attack you if you cross over into their territory. Chelmsford, one of the major mistakes he made, as we know now, but I think at the time, looking at this, was he ignored advice from people who'd been fighting the Zulu for decades. The Boers had been fighting the Zulu for decades and knew exactly what to do. And survived a major battle in 1838 in Blood River, doing exactly that by forming their wagons into the traditional circle and as American the Westerns show, but in South Africa it happened all the time with colonials. So the only defense you had against great numbers coming at you was a circle. So that is true.
But the disposition of the impis, that is correct, isn't it? They would just run, carry 2 or 3 days' rations, I believe, in like a pouch, and they were so mobile.
It is true. I mean, that's been exaggerated too, I must tell you, that, 50 miles a day. They were averaging 20 to 30 on the big days and probably closer to 15 to 20 miles. So, because the KwaZulu landscape is incredibly mountainous. So you're not going to get charging up and down these hills for 50 miles. I mean, we're talking about, sometimes thousands of feet up. And so it's nothing like the mountain ranges of India and so on, but there are significant mountains. And anyone, doesn't matter how fit you are, going to take quite a bit of strain, trotting along as they did. Yes, they did carry a lot of food, but thirdly, they got a lot of food where they would camp. So the chieftains on the routes they would take would be warned to prepare, and then they would harvest extra food and they would feed the impis passing by. So they carried quite a bit of food, but not as much as they needed, because they would just get it from the territory they passed through.
Right. And the numbers as well. I mean, I've read up to 25,000, as low as sort of 16, 17,000 of this particular part of the Zulu army. But we're thinking 20 to 22,000, I think.
Yes, it's everyone, the contemporary history, and also, if you look at all the details, it was definitely 20,000, possibly slightly more.
Right. And I do want to ask you about this, the local magistrate, Finn, of the famous Zululand Finn family. Forgive my British lack of awareness of South African details, but I've not heard of Finn. I'm just curious as to why he or his family are famous.
Well, I mean, Finn is incredible in South African history. Henry Francis Finn was the first trader to go and trade with Rorke. He took a major chance. He arrived in Durban, and actually initially had travelled by wagon all the way from the Eastern Cape, from a place called Grahamstown. And he arrived and he took a chance of going to speak to this warlike man called Rorke. And Rorke took a liking to him, and Rorke began allowing him to shoot elephants in the southern part of the territory around present-day Durban, the big city, the port city. And the relationship with the Zulu for the Finns developed from there. So Henry Francis Finn is famous in students of history in South Africa who follow these things.
Right.
And that was the link to the Finns. The Finns then became, a family that stayed in KwaZulu, like the Duns. And then, over the next few decades, their family grew, and the Finns are well known to this day.
Got you. Okay, so back to the movie, and it's night, and young Private Williams, who we met earlier, he comes across as very young and nervous. He hears a noise and calls stand to, much to the contempt of his fellow soldiers. Colour Sergeant Williams is also sceptical and heads to Private Williams' sentry post, about to roll at the young soldier when they all hear cavalry approaching, and it's Colonel Durnford arriving with a column of horsemen. However, Chelmsford is absolutely furious with Durnford for abandoning his ordered post, defending a possible counter-invasion by the Zulus, and we've got a little clip of the two of them at loggerheads with each other.
You intended to bring your reserves across the river. I've received intelligence from sources of my own that the Zulu impis are moving north of you to threaten your left.
Intelligence? Sources of your own? Did it not occur to you there may be native rumours? Rumours to draw you off, to leave the whole of Natal open to a possible counter-thrust?
Kitshwaya wants a head-on battle, a decisive victory, so that his people can get on with the one matter that is life and death for his nation, their delayed harvest.
Are you dictating the strategy of this water?
I'm explaining my reasons.
Yes?
A large party of Zulus have been sighted in the direction of the King's Kraal.
Tomorrow we will continue our advance on Ulundi. Durnford, kindly return to your unit. Bring them here immediately to support Pauline. Mr. Varriker will join you as ADC. Do you understand me clearly?
And the threat of
If on another occasion you flout my direct orders, I shall reluctantly relieve you of your command.
We see that the camp is being watched by Zulus. This is now the next day, and we've obviously just heard that Colonel Durnford has been told, bring your column up to reinforce Colonel Pauline. Pauline is careful, and he orders a stand to until Durnford's reinforcements arrive. His men deploy into defensive lines as Lord Chelmsford decides to pause his column's march for lunch. They've made it further up the valley by now. So Durnford and his force arrive. The 3 Zulu prisoners who earlier allowed themselves to be captured and tortured, they decide they need to escape to warn their leaders that the British have split their force. So they call for a guard, and when he eventually turns up, wondering what all the fuss is about, they overpower him, kill him, and escape the camp. Meanwhile, back with Lord Chelmsford and his part of the force, Noggs, the reporter, approaches Crelock and asks for some advice on military matters. He says he's always understood that a commander shouldn't split his force until he's sure of the enemy's disposition. Crelock counters that this would be true if they faced a European opponent armed with guns, but not against Zulus. Noggs appears unimpressed with this explanation, and when Crelock says, "May I remind you, I'm merely the Lord Chelmsford's secretary," Noggs sort of smirks at him and says, "Oh, I wouldn't take much comfort in that, Crelock, old boy. If he goes down, you're sure to sink with him." So we get this feeling that there's slight concern amongst certainly some of the officers and certainly Noggs, the reporter. So going back to the beginning, the discovery of the Zulu force. Now, Colonel Dartnell is certainly a name that comes up a lot in the histories. If he is credited in this movie, he's given a fairly small part.
Yeah. I mean, Dartnell and the whole story about the spies is a myth. They weren't kind of sent hither by Chetshwayo to go and take a hit, because the British would have just killed them. They wouldn't have spent time negotiating with them, and so that's complete myth. But the idea that Chetshwayo was using intelligence information is very true. I mean, he had an extensive network, and the Zulus were famous for it. All the way through to the Boer War, where they were used by the British extensively to spy on the Boers, for example. They had a very clever way of generating intelligence information for their military units. So they would have known what the British were up to, and they also were quite well informed about how the British fought wars.
Right.
They'd been watching the British for 100 years. That information had reached Zululand from the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape, where the frontier wars had been going on, and the 1700s of the British were in the Cape and so on. They weren't in a different part of the world. They were aware of how the British fought. So Durnford, arrived at the time that Chelmsford had actually left the camp. So I'm not sure how Chelmsford and Durnford ended up talking to each other, where Chelmsford was kind of explaining to Durnford that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he had ignored orders, because Durnford spoke to Pauline, and Durnford was Pauline's, technically his superior, I think you could say.
Yeah.
So all of that was kind of a bit of a thumbsuck, but I understood that they were using it to explain the history of the occasion more than anything else. And of course the journalist Noggs is very much the voice of reason, constantly in the background warning that there's something that's going wrong here, the crossing into the territory, the splitting of the force and so on. And it wasn't a true splitting of the force, of course. He took a few men with him, Chelmsford, but he didn't technically split his force, and Durnford's unit was fairly small. It was mainly the Natal native contingent with Durnford.
Yeah. And I think that clip we played, what it does show as well, it highlights the local knowledge that Durnford had when he says, look, Chetshwayo is desperate to get this finished quickly, and then his people can turn to the matter of life and death for them, which is the harvest, showing his understanding of how time works there and the seasons and people's priorities, and Chelmsford ignoring yet more, locally savvy advice. I mean, I don't know how knowledgeable Durnford was, but he's certainly been in South Africa for, I think, 7 or 8 years by then.
Yeah, I mean, Durnford was incredibly experienced in fighting the isiXhosa in the south. In fact, he had his arm, I think it was blown off, or he was paralyzed in his right arm Oh, it's his left arm, I think. Anyway, he was paralyzed in the fighting against the Isandhlwana. And while they weren't the Zulu, they were highly militarized, and also the same kind of folk in a way. There's this thing about, we've spoken about the Sioux and so on. And as I said to you in notes previously, I mean, the Zulu were not a Stone Age people. The Zulu were smelting iron, and they had large structures, and they had experienced networks. They were trading with the Arabs. The ancestors of the Zulu were trading with the Arabs for 500 years up the east coast of Africa. I mean, they knew a lot more than we are led to believe now. And some people have this myth about, how, they were backward or they didn't organize. They were highly organized.
Yeah.
And Durnford, having fought the Isandhlwana, and the Isandhlwana are, of course, closely related in Nguni terms to the Zulu. They just said that Xhosa had more cliques because they were in the San and what's called the Bushmen, the San and Khoi. They'd been fused with the Khoi and the San, who have many, many cliques in their language. Otherwise, they were the same people. So they came from the same kind of militarized, organized background, and they could also smelt iron weapons.
Yeah.
So Durnford, I think, is pretty accurately portrayed as highly experienced and recognizing a real danger.
Yeah. And there may also be the thing, as we see in Zulu at Rorke's Drift, by profession, he's an engineer, and the professional soldier tends to look down on the what they might view as a tradesman, even though he's wearing a military uniform. So back in the movie, back at Isandhlwana, Durnford asks Vereker about this possible impi to the north. Pauline assures him that Chelmsford has dismissed the idea as the approach would mean crossing a mountain range, but Durnford just comments, difficulty never deterred a Zulu commander yet. He suggests it would be wise to check, so Durnford and Vereker lead out patrols of cavalry. Some distance from the camp, they spot a herd of cattle and give chase, Vereker's attention being brought to it by one of his young officers crying, "Steak on the hoof, sir," which has always made me chuckle as a phrase. As they chase the cattle and crest a ridge, they see before them, resting around a small tarn in a bowl, a huge impi. The Zulus see the cavalry and leap to their feet and start to surge towards them. Vereker orders a young officer to warn the camp, and then orders one volley from his men before turning tail and heading away, because he only has a troop with him. The officer gallops into camp yelling "Zulus" and tells Colonel Pauline about the impi. A bugler sounds the alert, and the men tumble out of their tents to form up as artillery is also deployed. We see Colour Sergeant Williams with his company ordering range markers to be placed out ahead of the lines, but as the soldiers detailed for the job start pacing them out, they see on the next skyline the Zulu army arriving at the run. Meanwhile, up country a bit, Chelmsford's staff officers are taking lunch, and Vereker's messenger arrives. Crelock advises him that Pauline has a battle on his hands, but there are no further details. Sorry, that Crelock advises Lord Chelmsford. He says, Pauline seems to have a battle on his hand. Chelmsford asks a navy officer, Lieutenant Milne, who's painfully aristocratic by accent, to take his telescope up a nearby hill to observe the camp and report what he sees. He's clearly reluctant to dash back to Isandhlwana without some confirmation. And I don't think he really had... It's not, like you said, it's not like he's taken the bulk of the troops with him. He did have, a sizable force with him, but it's not like, he's left 100 men behind and he's got 10,000 with him. So, he must have been a little bit torn.
Yes, I said in the notes to you I was incorrect that he went to the northeast. He went to the southeast, which of course is the direction to Ulundi from where they were.
Yeah.
So Chelmsford sets off to go and find a way through, and I mean he was between a range of hills, the Magogo and the Inhlakazi, the two range. They're quite steeply rising hills. They're flat topped, butte topped, but they're quite steep, and the Buffalo River's to the south of the Machakata River. So he was kind of looking around to see how he's going to move this massive force of his through these mountains, so he was taking really a scouting group out. The problem, as you've said about Chelmsford, is that he couldn't physically see Isandhlwana from where he was. He was on the southeast slopes of a mountain between the two. So he was in exactly the worst place to be. Well, there was one worse, and that was to the north east, which is where the huge impi was. But he was in the second worst place, if you like, after that. As you've mentioned, he just guessed wrong, and he couldn't believe the dangers that existed.
No, for sure. Yeah, I mean, so some of the detail of the timings, it's kind of approximated, but pretty much, I think, even though the personalities, and again, we probably have a situation where if every individual involved is represented by an actor, that's another wage to pay, and it's another cast member the audience have got to remember. So we've probably got fewer people doing more things than they actually did on the day. But Pauline and Durnford are becoming aware that they are possibly under threat. But again, until they see them, they're probably also thinking, don't know if it is, don't know if it isn't, until we do see the impi arrive. And yeah, as you said, Pauline broke a few basic rules. He didn't strike the tents, which meant that his men didn't have good visibility all round. He probably didn't believe the Zulus were actually going to attack him because he's got over 1,000 men, and he's thinking, surely not. And his deployment, this is certainly something I've read, the deployment of the companies, they were sent too far out from the camp. They couldn't mutually support each other. The gaps between them too big. And on one crucial corner, he posted a company of the Natal native contingent. And this is not a criticism of the troops, but again, they had one rifle between 10 men and only 5 rounds. And yet they were deployed as if they were a rifle company on a crucial gap. So, yeah, Pauline's deployments don't seem to have been very well done.
No, and I think he was affected also by Chelmsford's thinking. As I said, I mean, Chelmsford really didn't have many options. Isandhlwana, which means a kind of a hut or a dwelling. And if you look at the pictures of Isandhlwana, it looks a bit like a big hat or a hut, the top of a hut. But they moved themselves up against the edge of that mountain, but enough space so that anyone with firearms could not really be effective from the top of the mountain. So instead of taking the high ground and putting pickets up there, they didn't do that. Both Chelmsford and Durnford and Pauline rather made the mistake of not successfully picketing the high ground. And I think you and I know from following military for years that you've got to have someone on the high ground keeping an eye out on things, and sending a telescope up at some point is just not the answer. The telescope's supposed to be there once you set in place. Before you send out your range markers, you go and secure the high ground, and they keep an eye on what's going on around you. The second thing to say is that Lieutenant Charles Rorke, he was involved with the scouts. What I don't understand is Rorke was experienced, and he spotted a large herd of cows, far, far larger than is required for the people in the area. And that's the stake on the hoof thing you're talking about. I mean, it was a significantly large herd, and they didn't put the one and one together to make two, which is, how come that herd is vast when the people around here don't really need a herd of that size?
Yeah.
And they didn't realize that the herd was linked to the large impi that was based to the northeast of where they spotted the herd in the dip, Ingwabeni. The famous Ingwabeni dip is a dry kind of gulch there. Donga, it's called in South African terms. And they were hiding there very quietly. And they followed the herd, because the herd boys, the little younger kids, ran away, and they followed them over the hill, and that's where they saw arranged before them the massive, majority of the 20,000 men waiting there quietly.
Which, if they ever do a Simpsons episode about this event, I guess that's the point that Homer would go, "Don't!" realising that, I think we might have made a mistake here. So, back to the movie. The Zulus are charging the British camp. Durnford and his horsemen ride out to meet them, dismounting. Basically, we call them cavalry because they're on horses, but I think they're mounted infantry. They ride out, dismount into a dry gully, using that as cover, start to fire volley after volley at the approaching warriors. Durnford sends a sergeant to find Lord Chelmsford, lucky chap, and tell him that the impi has been found and they're under attack from it. The range marking detail we saw being sent out by Bob Hoskins' character, Colour Sergeant Williams, earlier, they're legging it back to the lines. This is a rifleman, a private, and a young drummer boy, or a young bugler. And every time the assembled companies start firing volleys, so when they see a volley about to be fired, they hit the deck, wait for the firing to happen, and then get up. Unfortunately, one of the bullets kills the bugler. This is almost certainly fictional. I doubt if they know. So there's this great line where he says, he's come all this way to be hit by a bullet from Birmingham. The soldiers are also supported by artillery and rockets, although they only get a few rockets away before the rocket battery is overrun by Zulus. Pauline orders the artillery to cover Durnford's retreat back towards their lines. He seems quite calm still, and he watches the men mount their horses, this is Durnford's men, and ride back towards the camp. However, a wing of the Zulu attack cuts some of them off, and the horsemen dismount to fight it out with tragic and inevitable consequences. The lines of the 24th are still firing volley after volley, Colour Sergeant Williams calmly calling the orders to his company, but we hear several soldiers calling for more ammunition. At the ammunition wagon, the Quartermaster Sergeant Bloomfield is still strictly controlling the distribution of ammunition, and we've got a clip.
Holland, we will not issue ammunition from this wagon to any but authorised companies. This lot have their own. You can get your own wagon. Remember, Dyer!
How long have we got to wait, Quartermaster?
Get back in line, boy. Wait your turn.
But, sir...
Move!
What, pulling? Look, it ain't my fault. All the tops are screwed down. Come on, I'm waiting.
Meanwhile, Lieutenant Milne, the naval officer we saw being sent up the side of the hill, he's told Lord Chelmsford that haze prevented him seeing much at Isandhlwana, but he could see the wagons had been taken into the camp. Chelmsford asks him to inform Colonel Creelock, but as he does so, Major Harford rides up to Creelock, saying that Colonel Durnford's carbineer, the sergeant we saw being sent earlier, has brought his message and the camp is under threat. And we've got another clip. We're doing well for clips today.
The camp is under attack from a large force of Zulu. Colonel Pauline sends for help.
Calm yourself, Mr. Harford. Where do you come by this intelligence?
Durnford's carbineer himself rode from the camp.
Very well, go on.
One of the harness has already turned with the artillery.
He has. I see. Ride after Lord Chelmsford and acquaint him with your intelligence.
And Mr. Harford, control your passions.
A professional soldier must keep cool and thoughtful in times of stress.
So the action cuts back to the camp, where Durnford has made it back to the main body and Colonel Pauline with those of his men who weren't cut off during the retreat. The infantry companies are still firing in formation, but the Zulus have got around the back of the camp, over the sort of shoulder of the hill, and they're starting to slaughter the cooks, the wounded and the storemen. The formations start to break and it becomes every man for himself. Colour Sergeant Williams puts up a good fight with rifle and bayonet and then revolver before he's killed, as is his namesake, poor young Private Williams. Quartermaster Sergeant Bloomfield is still ordering soldiers to wait their turn for ammunition, even as Zulus approach his wagon. So, wow, quite a lot to unpack there. Now, it seems as if the Zulus were actually caught a bit on the hop themselves by being discovered so quickly, or so early.
Yeah, they were. In fact, the Indunas in charge automatically. The men began moving with the Indunas before any command. The Bulumanzi Kampanda was supposed to give the command along with Inchingwao Kamahloli Koza, who was part of it, part of the leadership there. And Kampandi was the half-brother, Tchwai, who was supposed to give the command, but he didn't. They just started moving because they realized they'd been spotted. Secondly, they were supposed to only attack at dawn on the 23rd. Thirdly, they actually attacked in reverse. The Zulus were so well trained that what happened there is they began launching the attack in reverse. Now, if you know from any military tacticians training, to actually get a large group of 20,000 troops to reverse order attack immediately on their own cognizance is, I find it pretty extraordinary. So
it's remarkable.
The defensive, it was supposed, the reserves attacked first, basically. And the arms swapped. The arms swapped their attack around. So the left arm became the right arm and so on. So they were so well drilled, they automatically went into attack. And then the Kampandi, just when he realized everything was kind of on the go, and he sussed out that they couldn't stop them anyway. They'd been, for days and days and days, they'd been marching towards us, and all the Impi, the troops, the Zulu troops, they were hot to trot, so to speak. And they literally were trotting. And so they just reversed order and continued with the fight. And the arms acted as they always had acted, except in reverse. So, yes, you're right. They were caught on the hop themselves.
Now, you've mentioned, is it Captain Shepstone because I believe this is the guy who, in the movie Zulu, at Rorke's Drift, arrives with a few horsemen who've escaped the battlefield, and then refuses to stay, and they ride off.
I think it's a lieutenant.
Right.
I could be wrong here. I'm not entirely certain. And I'm not sure about that part of the story. I mean, he's supposed to be a good horseman or something, and is regarded as, in the movie, I think they speak of him as being one of the more experienced troops and able to get to the point. But it looks like, when the attack started, things really became frayed on both sides, but particularly on the British side. So some of the native contingent ran, some didn't. Some of the British troops were caught in areas such as in the south face of Isandhlwana itself, and they were cut off and continued fighting. Some, went to ground and survived the first attack and crawled away. So I'm hesitant to I don't know for a fact what Shepstone was doing specifically at the time. I've got a really good military history journal of the battle, which I've been studying, and it's not really clear that he'd done anything wrong. Afterwards, he was accused, I think, of being a coward by some, not to his face, I think. But that's my hesitant answer to that. I apologize.
No, well, of course, what's not shown in the movie Zulu, and I know we're sort of jumping back to an earlier episode, I think episode 8 was the one where we covered Zulu. What's not shown is that the troops defending Rorke's Drift, when Shepstone's unit, I'm pretty sure it was him, this is the line where the Stanley Baker character, Lieutenant Chard, says, "All right, I'll use your men, deploy them in a screen. You know how the Zulus feel about cavalry." And he replies with, "I know how my men feel about Zulus," and they leave. Some of the British soldiers actually fired at them, and a corporal, because they had some locally recruited horsemen, but a British corporal with Shepstone was actually hit and killed. And this was sort of quietly hushed over after it all. So there was a little bit of blue on blue, as we used to call it. Bit of friendly fire, but it wasn't friendly. I mean, they were deliberately firing at them because they felt they were being left in the lurch, the lads at Rorke's Drift. Back here, though, the Zulus were getting real heavy casualties, weren't they, from the volley fire? And we've got this whole thing which was blamed for ages. I mean, I remember growing up reading stories about this. My dad took me to see this film as a birthday treat when I was about, what would I have been, 13 or 14, and I read some things after, and they said, "Oh yeah, the reason the British lost is because they couldn't get the ammunition boxes open," which I found staggering, and it's been overplayed, we think, hasn't it?
It has. I mean, it was well known you could break the top of those boxes with the butt of a rifle. And, if you consider the amount of adrenaline firing off, and if you're not going to fiddle with screws anyway, you're going to smack the butt of your rifle through the top of the ammunition box, and you're going to take the ammo out, even if you have a screwdriver. So I think that's overstretched. But what we know is true is that the ammunition was not getting to all the troops. So, and that was because it may have been the quartermaster being, as displayed in the movie, but I think more than likely it was the distance. If you look at the distances, if you walk that, we're talking about hundreds of meters here. You carry one of those 20-kilogram boxes, hundreds of meters, see how long it takes you to get, even in the midst of battle, go charging across the territory. And it's rocky territory, remember, it's not just sandy soil, it's really rocky. You're twisting your ankle the whole time, you're falling over. I just think they couldn't move the boxes quickly enough.
No, absolutely. And I mean, to reference yet again the battle at Rorke's Drift that would happen the next day, and we see Commissary Dalton, who's portrayed in the movie Zulu as a slightly effeminate man. The commissary he was an ex-sergeant major. He'd fought against the Hosa. He'd been wounded and I think medically retired. He was given medals. Also, he was hard as nails. But he got his lads to run round, and literally every rifleman up on the ramparts at Rorke's Drift, some of them said afterwards, every time I put my hand in my ammo pouch, I had more ammunition than the last time I put my hand in there. And they just went round and distributed it so effectively, and there's the difference, probably. I mean, we'll come on to that again a little bit later on. but the positioning of the rifle companies just seems to have been flawed, and you'd think an effective commander seeing it might have commanded his men. It seems that the Zulus didn't even need that. They instinctively, they could look themselves and they knew exactly where the weak points were, and they were able to exploit them.
Yeah, if you look at the 24th and the other arrangements, that the 3rd, the 2nd, the 1st, the mounted men were on the far right, along with parts of the foot of the 23rd. They kind of split themselves up. The native contingent was under the brow of the hill, the saddle, to the directly east of Isandhlwana, the hill itself. They were too spread out. We know now, but it's easy enough to say, look, they've been trained to spread themselves out because of warfare against people with firearms. And, against that kind of situation, it may have worked a little better. But they were too far from the camp itself. They took a chance, I think, with that. They had range markers already out. They knew roughly the ranges, so that was, complete myth. Shepston rode in to warn Pulaine in time. I think they just exaggerated his part in the movie, but, he didn't appear as a major character. He was a captain, you're right, by the way. He's a captain of the native horse. And they turned him to a larger-than-life character, I think, for the movie. He did warn Pulaine. He was the one who was pretty urgent about it. And if you look at where the rocket battery was, the rocket battery got off one rocket. It was, if you look at the map and the diagrams, it was far out of the way. It was, I know rockets are used sometimes as offensive weapons, but it should have really been behind the troops. It ended up right out in front, in the middle of nowhere, literally in the north, I think eastern section of the battlefield, and we're talking about hundreds of meters away from the line of the 24th and the 3rd and the native contingent. So there were some surprising decisions made there. If you look at the lay of the land, they seemed, I think in a nutshell, to have decided that there was not much of a threat. So they seem to have broken a few rules, didn't they? No pickets on the top of the mountain, no proper telescope viewing around, no control of the high ground, no knowledge of 2 to 5 miles away what was going on. The Zulus were literally 5 miles away, or 4 miles away in that donga, and we're talking about two large armies, and there was no forest. It's not like there was a jungle in the way. So yes,
open ground, definitely. Yeah.
So some surprising decisions taken all around when it came to tactics.
It's not covered by the scope of this movie because it really just deals with the battle in the immediate aftermath, as in that night. And then I guess the idea is you go back and watch Zulu because that covers what happened at Rorke's Drift, the desperate need to get some kind of credit out of everything that was going on. But if you look further down the line, I think it could be described as a Pyrrhic victory for Cetshwayo and the Zulu because, he might well have said, similar to Pyrrhus, another victory like that and we're finished, because the cost on his men was pretty grim. This was the I think it was a Greek or Mesopotamian leader, Pyrrhus, who invaded Italy and kept beating Roman armies and then saying, when are they going to give up? And they just raise another army and go at him again. He said, any civilized people would have known they'd been beaten by now. If we suffer another victory like that, we're completely finished. And eventually he was, and took himself away. But back to the movie, we see Private Story, the soldier who was earlier tasked with placing the range markers. He finds one last round, takes careful aim, and shoots down one of the Zulu commanders, the Indunas, I think you said they're called. But then Story is Assegai himself. And we see Zulu streaming through the camp as Pulaine sees all is lost. And we've got a brief clip with the actions he decides to take.
Well fought, gentlemen. It's time to save the colours. Get to Rorke's Drift. You must warn them. The colours. Carry them to safety, Mr. Melville. Sir.
So So the colours are now leaving the battlefield in the hands of Lieutenants Melville and Coghill on horseback, at which point, for some strange reason, Pauline decides to go into his tent and write a diary entry. Meanwhile, Colonel Durnford gives his horse to one of his Sakali sergeants and asks him to ride to Natal and tell the bishop, and then corrects himself and says, well, the bishop's daughter, that I was obliged to remain with my infantry. By now, a stream of fugitives from the battle are streaming towards the river and Natal, and what they hope is going to be safety. Bloomfield and his lad Pullen are dead by their ammunition wagon. Pauline is killed in his tent by one of the Zulus who'd earlier been a prisoner and possibly one of Kitchereau's sons. Vereker joins up with Melvin and Coghill as they ride for their lives. Now Durnford falls as all organised resistance collapses. Durnford has a bit of a last stand. The group of officers with the colours make it to the river, but they're overrun as they reach the Natal bank. Melville and Coghill are killed, and the colours are taken, but the Zulu carrying them runs up the hill opposite as Vereker, lying trapped underneath his horse and presumably dying, takes careful aim with his rifle and with his last breath manages to shoot the warrior, the colours fluttering down to land in the river and float off downstream. You've got some interesting points here. There were some rallying attempts made by some of the British units, weren't there?
Yeah, there were. There were groups of up to 100 British troops who went back to back and actually fought for a lot longer than it's shown in the movie. It looks like up to 45 minutes. And the ones that passed the 24th, and I'm not sure exactly who was in charge of them, and no one really is to this day, for reasons we'll discuss after this. But it looks like up to 70 to 100 men had formed a square of their own making to the northeast of where the tents were, in other words, close to the brow of the hill. There were another group under the brow of Isandhlwana itself fighting separately, which is another story. But and then they kept the Zulus at bay for some time. Some people say it could be as long as half an hour to 45 minutes, where they fought hand to hand with the rifles out of ammunition, and they were just basically using bayonets and the rifle butts. And in the Zulu tradition, what the discussion is that Zulus were forced to pick up their own men and throw them at the square to try and spike the bayonets that were coming at them so they could make a move and attack. So that's the one thing from the Zulu.
Their own dead men, I assume.
Yes, or dead men lying around, and most of them were their own at that point. And that's in Zulu oral tradition. So there's been some suggestion it was exaggerated, but I don't think so. I think that they were saying that, look, this was not an easy battle. There were far more of the Zulus. There were 20,000 of them, and up to 3,000 died. But it was a really difficult battle, and I think we need to say that the oral tradition points that it was extremely difficult to kill all of the English in that battle. It was not a matter of they just surrounded and then stabbed them. They formed quite strong defensive squares and fought for quite a while before the Zulu were able to overcome them. And the reason why I say that is because later on, Chelmsford actually came across some of the remnants of the Zulu marching away, and they ignored each other.
Right.
Because the Zulu oral tradition says the Zulus were completely shattered. They were exhausted. They'd been fighting non-stop for a couple of hours, physically fighting, and they had it. They kind of, once they'd rifled and looted the camp, they formed up again. They were not into fighting further. So I think there's a lot of credence to the stories that the movie shows that they were overrun, and that was the end of that. But I think that the fighting went on for a lot longer than that the British given credit for in the movie itself. And that, by the way, as I said, comes from the Zulu side.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, when you wrote about Captain Younghusband, that's a name that jumped into my memory of reading that his company made a very effective defence. And this single soldier, who will never know his name, but apparently crawled into a cave, and he must have taken a stash of ammunition with him, and he held them off for quite a while, and then he was hit by a ricochet of Zulus firing rifles in towards this cave, and eventually he was hit. And Durnford has gone into Zulu legend, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Durnford's last stand was made next to the tents immediately to the south of Isandhlwana itself. And Durnford and Chelmsford, but Durnford in particular, is mentioned by the oral tradition as being courageous, fighting to the end. Younghusband as well is known. as a name. I'm not quite sure how it passed through into Zulu culture and tradition from there. They didn't take anyone's passbooks or ID books or anything. I think they just got to know about who it was who did that. And thirdly, the man who we don't know about, what his name was, his body was found in the small cave right up against the side of Isandhlwana itself. There's speculation he could have lasted as long as an hour by himself there. And there were a lot of Zulu bodies outside the cave entrance. So, I mean, all told, this is an epic struggle. Yes, if you look, I think we need to take a step back and say the Chelmsford had no chance anyway. I mean, he could have been anywhere, and I don't think he had a chance against these Zulu impis unless he formed himself into a proper lager and had gone about the defense of his area in a different way. He had no chance. His troops had no chance. They were kind of dead men walking, I feel, from the time that they set up camp, because of just the pure numbers coming their way.
Yeah, and unless, of course, they'd had a defensive position which you can see the efficiency or the effectiveness of that at Rorke's Drift, where comparison numbers. There were about 3,000 or 4,000 Zulus and 100 British soldiers instead of 1,000 held them off because they had a defensive position that was quite difficult to actually get over and get to hand for the Zulus attacking them. So. Yeah, and I think, because you mentioned here the commander of the right horn of the Zulu attack, Dabu Lumanzi, was he a son or a brother of Cetshwayo? Was he a son?
No, he was the half-brother of the
half-brother, right. Because wasn't it his impi that didn't actually get directly involved, that he then took off to attack Rorke's Drift against... wasn't it something like it was against orders, or he certainly
Yes.
hadn't been told to do it, but his men hadn't washed their spears, as I believe they called it, so they wanted to go and get involved.
Yeah, they were the last to arrive. They came around the north western side of the mountain. They kind of went in a loop around the northwest, and of course, as they came down the mountain, they met a lot of the English and native contingent who were making a run for the direction of Rorke's Drift, which is to the west. So as they came around from the north, they saw in front of them streams, and we're talking about a few hundred people running, throwing off, in the native contingent side, they were throwing off their headbands to make them look as if they were part of the Zulu contingents and so on. And some of the English had also making a run for it. And of course, Melvin and Coggle came past shortly afterwards. So you can imagine the stream of impi coming around the mountain. Then they see people running towards the west to their right. And then they hived off quite a large portion of that impi. It was the Isandhlwana impi, the Undi Corps it was called. They hived off to follow the, ironically, the colours were involved in that moment as well, to follow the fleeing men that they saw.
And the colours did end up in the river, didn't they? And I believe they were recovered a few days later downstream somewhere. They were actually recovered by the British.
Yeah, I mean, this story is also interesting. What happened is that Coggle had a serious knee injury. He'd injured himself, and I think it sounded like he had dislocated his knee. So, and Melvin and Coggle, of course, were trying to get away. Melville was behind him with the colours and slipped in the river and dropped the colours. They were going in and remember, the river was in spate, as we've said. So it was flowing much, much more strongly than the photographs that I've seen of what people say that the river looked like. It's an extremely violent river. And a lot of the troops trying to get away actually drowned, both English and the Zulu native contingent, in the river trying to get across it. The Zulu, of course, following them, knew that there was a better drift to the north of that in the Buffalo River and used that. But meantime, the colours had been swept downstream. Of course, the Zulu didn't care about the colours. They completely ignored that flowing past. It was just a flapping piece of textile. They were really more interested in, as you said, in killing the people trying to get away. So they then turned and chased after Melville and Coggle. Coggle turned around and came back and picked Melville up from the river, and then they were both caught about 150 meters, 200 meters to the west of the Buffalo River in a little donga. They were caught there and both killed.
And Lieutenant Rorke definitely was killed at Isandhlwana, but I've not read anything to say that he made it to... Did it become called Fugitives Drift, the crossing point that they tried to make it to?
Yes, it's known as Fugitives Drift, yes.
Right. But interestingly, one of only 5 Imperial, as in British officers to escape that day was Lieutenant Horace Smith-Dorrien, who was transport officer for a Royal Artillery detachment, and he was on a pretty tough, hardy local pony, and he rode it to safety. He's attributed his survival to having worn his blue patrol jacket that day, not his red jacket. And he heard later that Quechua had said, ignore the civilians, just kill the red-coated soldiers. They're the ones who are going to prove a problem. Well, Smith-Dorrien would write a report about the ammunition boxes that did lead to a change of both design and procedure. He would go on to serve in the Second Anglo-Boer War, the subject of course, your podcast, Des, and he became a general in the First World War, considered one of the more enlightened World War I British senior officers. He was quite happy to argue with superiors, a trait he also said came from his survival at Isandhlwana. And I'm paraphrasing it, I can't remember the exact words, I couldn't find the quote, but I remember reading him saying, every day since that day has been an undeserved blessing, ensuring that I must do what is right to justify my continued existence. In other words, he's like, really, I should have died that day, as so many other people did. The fact I didn't means I don't really care if you threaten my career or you threaten this, that or the other. I'm not really that bothered. Because, I shouldn't, every day's a bonus kind of thing. But, Smith-Dorrien, I've read a few bits about him. He does sound like a quite an effective chap.
I mean, you have to like him. And during the First World War, he had he was suspended, I think, or removed from the battle because he refused to attack, saying that it would be too damaging to his men, too destructive. So you're right. I mean, he had a strong spine when it came to understanding what is pragmatic and what is not pragmatic when it came to military matters. During the Boer War as well, Anglo-Boer War, he was really, really effective leader of men. And also, you're right, a lot of the civilians were wearing blue or black and jackets, and they were left alone by the Zulus. They could make their escape. So, yes, that is well known. One of the side stories of this whole struggle.
So, back to the movie, we see a patrol arrive to see the destroyed camp littered with corpses. Lord Chelmsford is with them, stony-faced. Creelock informs him they have a report. Some of their men have ridden towards Rorke's Drift, and they've seen an orange glow in the sky. It appears to be on fire. It's dark by now. He asks if they should move to the drift. Chelmsford is silent and doesn't reply. The end titles tell us that Isandhlwana was recorded as the worst defeat ever inflicted on a modern army by native troops. Benjamin Disraeli, the British Prime Minister whose government was brought down, partly due to this disaster, asked, "Who are these Zulus? These remarkable people who defeat our generals, convert our bishops, and have put an end to a great dynasty." And we'll address that in a moment. But yeah, I mean, the events that took place that night and the next day are depicted in the movie Zulu. But yeah, they would have seen already that Rorke's Drift was in trouble as well, and they could probably hear the firing.
They could. I mean, when Chelmsford arrived, part of his force arrived early at about 6. And of course, it's summertime, so it gets dark in that part of the country at around 7:30, 7:45 in summer, much earlier than Northern Hemisphere. But that's, he arrived at about 9 p.m. and could see nothing. But they could see the fire, the licks of flame from Rorke's Drift a number of miles away to the west. That is true. They could even hear, at times, they could hear the sounds of battle. They could hear retorts and the sounds of the firearms. But it was very, very indistinct, that part. So Chelmsford did not want to stay at Isandhlwana. He left. He didn't want the troops to see. So he made them camp in amongst the dead, by the way. And then early in the morning, before dawn, he made them get up and leave. So they didn't see the effect of the battle.
And one thing I skipped over from your notes, which was fascinating, is that there was no attempt made to bury the dead until May, like 5 months later. That's extraordinary. And fascinatingly, you said by the time they did go back and the ground was very hard, the wildlife will have obviously taken care of a lot of the edible parts of the dead soldiers, and they were buried under cairns, I think, was it? With they were indistinguishable. The British soldiers and the Zulus. There would have been very little way of telling who was who, which just kind of gives you a nice little, we come from the same stock, we go back to the same stock,
Well, it is a true story. And what happened is, because the Zulus were what they did is they would strip the troops. And one of the first things they took were their tunics. So they basically stripped the English troops, and then they would slice open the stomachs of their enemies as a sign of respect to allow their spirit free. And of course, both sides were doing it. So in other words, the Zulus also having their stomachs split open who were dead. And then because the tunics had been taken off and a lot of the clothing on, after 5 months in the sun and the rain, and also with the animals, there were many that were identified, of course, as English troops or as Zulu, but there were hundreds and perhaps thousands who could not be identified. And of course, because they'd fought hand to hand, they were lying, jumbled amongst each other. And thirdly, the wild animals we're talking about here are hyenas, which can literally chew your femur in half in one single bite. So 5 months of having a banquet for the wild animals of the district, they cleaned up the area substantially, and the ground is extremely hard. It's shale, very hard shale, hard rock, and it's only a few inches below the surface of the soil. So what they did is they would build rock cairns, and they gave up trying to identify who was who and just put bodies in areas into the same cairn. So yes, the Zulu dead and the British dead are buried together under those cairns, and there are around 46, I think, of those that were created.
Wow. It feels sort of appropriate, I think, because no, I don't think anyone disgraced themselves, but yeah, just that kind of wow. It's one of those places that I've always thought, if I ever do get round to visiting South Africa, I would love to go, especially with an expert local guide. Hint.
I'm not one of those. There's some brilliant local guides there, and of course the best one who knows, David Rattray. He was actually unfortunately killed in a robbery a few years ago, but he's literally world famous, and he's got a whole audiobook series, David Rattray, called The Day of the Dead Moon, because we haven't mentioned the fact that there was actually an eclipse halfway through this battle, or 3/4 of the way through it.
Wow, I didn't know that either.
There was an eclipse, which by that stage, the Zulus were fighting and the English were fighting, and no one seemed to notice that they thought they'd been fighting for so long and so hard that it was nighttime. That they'd been fighting the battle started at around 12:30. They came over the hill. The fight continued to nearly 3 o'clock. So we're talking about 3 hours of battling here. And then I can't remember the exact time, it's something like 2:30 or 2:49, somewhere around there was an eclipse. And the Zulus fighting thought, geez, we've been fighting all day, the sun's going down. But it was an eclipse, and then they said suddenly it became light again, and it wasn't as if anyone stopped. The fighting continued, but it was a remarkable natural event in the middle of one of the most extraordinary battles in history, that you had an eclipse.
Yeah, and you can imagine people taking great significance from that. One thing, in the closing titles, we have Disraeli talking about the Zulus putting an end to a great dynasty. As a 14-year-old boy watching the movie, I remember thinking, well, was Vereker, because he was they made a big show in the movie of the Simon Ward character, Lieutenant Vereker, William Vereker, being a lord, or his father was a lord, and I thought, was he a great dynasty? Of course, what he was referring to actually didn't happen for several months, nearly 6 months, and that was the Prince Imperial, who was a descendant of Napoleon Bonaparte, son of the deposed Napoleon III. He'd attended Sandhurst, and he was an officer in the British Army, kind of. He was like a guest officer. But later that year, when the campaign was still going off, he went off riding with a small group of troops and another officer, and they were attacked by a few Zulus who managed to kill the young man. And the officer who was not killed next to him said, oh, well, we lost him. When we found him again, the Zulus had gone. I think there were a lot of eyebrows raised about that. But yeah, so that's the end of the great dynasty that was referred to at the end of the movie. But of course the movie skips over it, so we don't actually see an explanation for that. So it's a strange thing for them to include.
Well, it had such an effect at the time. It was he was killed on June the 1st on the way to Ulundi. The Prince Imperial, Napoleon Prince Imperial, Louis Napoleon, he was killed And he died quite courageously, by the way, but he was the last in the line. And Buller was involved in that as well. Buller was in charge of the unit that he was traveling with. So Buller, who ended up fighting the Anglo-Boer War and becoming derided for his actions in Natal later. And Buller turned to the staff involved and said, "You destroyed us." And of course, the French were apocalyptic at the time, and they had there were all sorts of stories of when they went to pick up the body the next day, a few miles from where the unit had been based on the way to Ulundi, and they put him on top of a carriage, and they had the full military honours thing going there with Buller and the members of the army in Chelmsford as well, marching behind his hearse, if you like, going to be buried. His body is still in the grave in KwaZulu-Natal. And so I think that's why, is because it was such an extraordinary event from royal family perspective at the time, that's why I think they felt obligated to mention that during the Zulu War this happened.
Yeah. I mean, going back to Isandhlwana, that also had the defeat was a huge shock to Victorian Britain, led to a sustained effort to finish the war with the Zulus, something that Lord Chelmsford finally achieved at the Battle of Ulundi, half a year later, just before he was replaced. In fact, I think Sir Garnet Wolseley had already arrived in South Africa to replace him when the battle happened. So Chelmsford, I guess, felt slightly justified that he at least saw them to the end. There's little known in Britain these days of Chloban, I don't know if I'm pronounced that correctly, and Esho in Tombi, which a number of these were defeats for the British again, but Kambula seen as the turning point, and then the final showdown at Ulundi, where Chelmsford got his pitched battle that he could direct. Tactically, he seems to have been quite good. Strategically, maybe not so good. But yeah, you've got some really interesting stuff about Cetshwayo and the end of that war and the echoes that have come down to us from something that happened 150 years ago.
Well, Cetshwayo was, he's a respected enemy. So Ishawi, which is very close to where I grew up, went to school. On the 23rd of January to the 3rd of April, there was a siege of Ishawi by a large unit, and one of the columns was actually held up there. The Klobani was one of the battles you mentioned, Kambula and Ngengdlovu, and then Ulundi happened on the 4th of July. There's a spate of battles between January, about 6, through to Ulundi. Battles, I say inverted commas, some are smaller kind of confrontations, if you like. But Ulundi, of course, was the major battle. And as you said about Pyrrhus, it was a Pyrrhic victory for Cetshwayo. I think he was aware that he was not going to win, and he would go down honourably. And because of that, he was treated honourably, I think, by the British afterwards. They took him to Cape Town, and he began to pine away, and eventually was sent back after being exiled, because they were fearful he would begin to mobilise his men again. He was sent back to KwaZulu, and he died in Ishawi, and he's buried on the side of the hill. It's facing to the ocean, to the south side of, or Ushowi as it's known in Zulu.
Right.
Which is a administrative town. We have about 65,000 people now. It's on top of a mountain. It's very picturesque, and that's where he's buried. But Cetshwayo was kind of treated. I mean, he was exiled, which is what happens to leaders like Napoleon and Cetshwayo. They get exiled. He wasn't summarily shot as a kind of savage warrior, so to speak. He was treated with quite a bit of courtesy, I think, by the English to some extent.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose almost like Red Cloud touring with Buffalo Bill's circus, and the fascination that people would have with you could think about Pocahontas being taken to England and introduced to the royal family and the like, however badly she was definitely treated, bless her. You can understand that fascination. And in London coffee houses, people reading their newspapers thinking, how on earth did this happen to our troops? I'd intended to compare this defeat with the annihilation of Custer's command at the Battle of Little Bighorn, which we referenced earlier, until I did a quick check and discovered actually Little Bighorn wasn't the heaviest defeat of US forces by Native Americans. That dubious honour belongs to General St. Clair, who led a force into disaster in 1791 at the Wabash River. Not something that apparently many Americans would even know about, because it's not really talked about, because it didn't have great long-term historical effects. But what's interesting, it was a force of about 1,000 warriors of a coalition of tribes. They surrounded and defeated a force twice their size. We normally think of, like Isandhlwana or Rorke's Drift. It's the armed with firearms small number against the spear or bow and arrow armed, thousands of enemy warriors. Well, these tribes they were outnumbered. There were 2,000 American troops, but and Native Americans inflicted over 600 dead and 300 wounded. So that was their worst defeat. I think we've already mentioned the reference to a modern army, the defeat of a modern army by native troops. I mean, the Zulus didn't jump out of a time warp. They were modern in their own way, just as much as we were. The British, sorry. It's obviously nothing to do with me personally, but I suppose my ancestors. They didn't have firearms, but they did have some firearms, but they weren't industrialized in the sense we would. But as we've discussed, as you've revealed to us, their tactics were very developed and very sophisticated. Their communications were very sophisticated. Their mobility was just, mind-boggling. I think there's a really telling phrase in the movie where one nervous bearded soldier stands there and his mate next to him says, they won't stand against these bullets. And he says, yeah, but bullets run out and those bloody spears don't. And you think, yeah.
And there's another fact which, just very quickly to give credence to what you're saying. I mean, in 5 days, Chelmsford's men had travelled 80 miles and Chelmsford men had travelled 6.9 miles. So
wow.
You look at mobility as the secret of modern warfare in large terms, and of course that is exactly what you're saying.
Yeah. No, it's exactly what the Germans discovered at the beginning of the Second World War. What they saw with the advent of the tank, obviously invented and used by the British in the First World War, and that whole thing of just being able to move so quickly. And it was one of Caesar's great strengths, is people could not believe how quickly he could move. And it was interesting you were saying about, the myths about the Zulus could move 50 miles a day. I mean, I think a legion is completely self-contained. Marius's mules, as they got nicknamed, when General Marius trained a professional army, the first professional army Rome had. 15 miles a day was normal. Pushed hard, they could do 20, and there were occasions where desperation would force them, they could do 25 or 30 miles a day. But that was pretty much the limit. But that's pretty remarkable when you think you're talking about thousands of men with their equipment being organised, woken, fed, moved, stopped, and again, I think we discussed offline earlier, there's an argument that Roman legionaries would have done better against, I'm not sure about the Zulus, but certainly against the North American Indians, partly because every time they stopped, they built a defensive position. Maybe the British should have done that, or taken the Boer advice and made a defensive position out of their wagons. But yeah, if he had 170 wagons, that's complicated.
Yeah, that's the crux of this whole thing, is that they couldn't make earthwork defensive positions because the earth was too hard. And they didn't take the other option, which the Boers had learned, which was that you create a lager of wagons. And it's very simple. It's either one or the other. Or you use the geography to your favor. You place yourself across a river. And so you're only defending on 3 sides. The 4th side is much easier. And they didn't do any of that. Chelmsford did not do any of that. So, he's been rightly criticized. I mean, he did split his force. That did have an effect. But I don't think they would have defeated the Zulus even if they had the whole force together there. And it's not just me saying that. The way that he had structured the units and his defensive position doomed everyone before the battle started.
Traditionally at this stage, we give the movie a score out of 10 for entertainment and for history. Now, or for historical accuracy, the entertainment value, I'm possibly slightly tinged by nostalgia, because when I saw this as a teenage boy, I found it really quite affecting. But I also do remember with a little a little pinch of shame that I remember coming out thinking, I can't believe we lost our lads, and I was so sort of looking at it from a British perspective. And now, obviously older and hopefully wiser to a degree, just thinking, war is always a tragedy, but it's also a fairly natural human condition to find ourselves in. I'm kind of just awestruck by the courage and dedication on both sides, and the abilities certainly on the Zulu side, stacked against the just stubbornness on the British defender side, but completely hamstrung by lack of preparation.
Yes, I agree. I think I'd score an 8 for both.
Yeah,
I thought they were much more accurate historically than they're given credit. Yes, they dramatized narrative and so on, but that I kind of vaguely ignore. The way in which they did the uniforms were pretty accurate. If you look at the colorization of the time, the way they represented the British uniforms was pretty accurate. The way they represented the Zulus, and importantly the Zulu, the different impis, the army, the different army. That's mine on my side. I apologize.
Okay, no worries.
The way they colored the shields, the different colors, and so on, which are different skin colors, that was all pretty accurate. The way they represented the fight itself, the charge. And I stress, the reason why is because they were using Zulus who grew up in Zululand, being trained to be Zulus, and they used them in the movie. So, yeah, all those things for me, it kind of resonates. The dramatic part of the colors, that's all part of storytelling. But it's pretty true. That's what happened to the colors. They were found a few days floating downriver.
And if anyone who maybe doesn't have an intimate knowledge of British military tradition, the colours have a significance that is ridiculous if you look at it in purely pragmatic terms. But and you've been a soldier, Des, it's like the Roman eagle. It's such a dishonour to lose, and they were literally a rallying point. But also it was that thing of you cannot lose your colours. The dishonour was so great. The Royal Artillery made a very, very clever decision, and they made their colours the guns. They said the guns are our colours. So the idea being you never abandon or lose your guns to the enemy. But yeah, it's extraordinary. You think about, again, going back to the Romans and Caesar's first armed reconnaissance of Britain. He only has 2 legions, and they're very, very nervous. They've heard all these stories that the Britons can summon up demons and all sorts. And the Roman soldiers are refusing to get off their boats. So the Aquilifer, the carrier of the bearer of the eagle of one of the legions, leaps overboard over the ship and says, well, I'll do my duty at least, and you'll lose your eagle to the enemy. And at that point, of course, all the soldiers then go, oh, we can't have that, and they follow him and successfully land. So it's a similar thing, but it's fascinating to hear comment that the Zulus are like, well, it's just a piece of cloth. That can't hurt us. We don't care. And whereas with Europeans, there's great Sergeant McEwen, I think it was, who in the Napoleonic Wars was the first British soldier to capture an eagle from one of Napoleon's units in Spain somewhere. And the huge fuss made of him, he's sort of can retire for life comfortably because of that one exploit. What difference does it make? But from my former soldier's point of view, you think, no, but things like that are important. They're unquantifiable, but they are important.
Yeah, the Zulus had 2 ways of showing that. I mean, the one was necklaces hewn out of a special tree, which you were not allowed to touch the tree except if you were going to make a necklace, and the king would then determine who got the necklace for courage.
Yeah.
And the other was a senior person who would have a metal band placed around their wrist. And those were the 2 colors. And of course, the Zulus who had those colors would fight tooth and nail to keep them. So what I'm saying, the flag was not important to them. They did have their own form of colors that they would then ascribe importance to. But if you'd said to them at the time, he has a red tunic of a dead private, and he has the colors, they would have taken the red tunic.
Yeah, of course. Des, thank you so much. It's yet again, you've given your time to us, and it's so fascinating to have your in-depth knowledge and your immersion in the culture where this happened, and the countryside where this happened, and I really do hope one day to get down and visit when these strange times are over. Looking forward, we're hoping that the next episode should be with Chris Swimmer, and we'll be looking at Billy the Kid and the movie Young Guns. But I'm hopefully, and I think I'm pretty confident in saying, certainly from our point of view, that our relationship and our work with Des is not over. We've got a couple of other movies we're looking at in the future with South African themes, and I do strongly encourage people, if you haven't listened to it yet, tune into the Anglo-Boer War Podcast, which Des hosts. It's really fantastic. You've got a great delivery. I think I've gently ribbed you before on the typical British officer has a high-pitched, effeminate voice, and the typical Boer commander has a deep, gruff voice. And it's a characterization that it's not at all flippant, but it's really it's I hate the phrase, but infotainment, or edutainment, as someone called it. It is fascinating, and there's so many of the world's great characters from the early 20th century who were there. Mahatma Gandhi, Winston Churchill, Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes books. All these characters that you think, wow. And one thing I forgot to mention, Smith Dorrien, who was in the Anglo-Boer War, in the First World War at Isandhlwana, he was involved in the last battle, and I can't remember its name, something like Kison or Kimon. I think it was in the Sudan. It was the last battle at which British soldiers wore red jackets. After that, it was all into khaki and beige. So, yeah, another tick in the box of Horace Smith Dorrien's historical notebook. But Des, thank you so much, and we will speak to you again soon, and all the very best to you and yours, and of course your listeners.
Thank you so much, Martin. Thank you for having me. I really value this. It's been fantastic talking to you, someone so well organized and so informed, so thank you.
Thanks, and bye everyone.